Hello, I will be lecturing on reading number 14. Alcohol allows you not to be yourself, or allows you to not be yourself. And this is, oops, sorry, give me one second here. So yeah, towards a structured understanding of alcohol use and gender difference among gay, lesbian, and heterosexual youth. So yeah, I'm just going to get right into this. This is 2008 here. But yeah, moving on to the introduction here. We're really looking into a lot of these gender differences here. And so when we violate norms in our society, we often give two types of accounts: excuses and justifications. So excuses would be things like it was wrong, but it wasn't my fault. Justifications, I did it, but it just wasn't wrong. In our society, alcohol is used to provide oops, excuse me, real quick. Sorry here. Alcohol is used to provide a timeout from our social norms here. And what we see is we often refer to this as a moral holiday here. We do things we normally wouldn't do. And then we feel like we have the excuse for the justification for what we've done and when we've done it. Drinking alcohol can have a valid excuse. Oh, give me a second. I got to pause this real quick. All right. Sorry. So, like I said, drinking alcohol can be a valid excuse can drinking alcohol, be a valid excuse for deviant or otherwise unacceptable behavior. Really, such as casual sex amongst heterosexual women, the research shows, but it excuse other gender violations. So, some of these other ones that we're not as familiar with, perhaps maybe playing out. So moving in on the topic of the social construction of gender here. So when we're talking about this, we're acknowledging that we do gender and situation by behaving in gender normative, in these gender normative excuse me, or what we think of as gender appropriate ways here. So gender is constantly performed and maintained by our actions. And what we see here is, excuse me, sorry, I'm juggling a few things here. Give me a second. I'm going to pause this. 1 second, so I don't say. So when we talk about the social construction of gender here, we're acknowledging that we do gender and situation by behaving in gender normative, or what we think of as gender appropriate ways. Gender is constantly performed and maintained by our actions, and violations of gender sexually norms are negatively viewed, negatively sanctioned here, and there's often harsh consequences for that. We have a quote from the book here: the social structure itself appears to be a performance that gender is situated, and gender behavior reproduces structure here. So basically, every day we behave in gender normative ways. We're reinforcing gender expectations, and typically violations of gender or sexuality norms are viewed very harshly. To speak, so give me 1 second. Moving on here. So now we're just going to speak briefly on the structured action theory here. So this is kind of, when we're talking about this describes the way social structures are reproduced through specific actions, specific context, and situation. So it really describes the complicated ways we do gender across situation and context here. And so in this article, they talk a lot about gender difference. Gender difference means not displaying normative gender behaviors or our appearance that a situation requires. So another way of thinking is breaking the social norms or expectations, but it's meant to be a neutral label for gender deviant actions and expressions. This research wanted to address three questions here. So these are the three research questions that they were, trying to address through this. We see the first one here: does alcohol motivate men and women and those that they interact with and engage in ignore inappropriate displays of gender? How does alcohol use excuse inappropriate gender displays, i.e. this kind of gender difference? And, how are those used to kind of used to assuage guilt and shame associated with gender difference? So let's move on to the research methods here. The research methods, this is data from 78 college students between 1997 2001. These were in-depth interviews here, so about an hour and a half each. And they did purposive sampling to gain sufficient sample sizes across minority groups, including LGBT community, African Americans, and they were semi-structured, open-ended interviews meant to, guide and to help develop after pilot testing here. And so the qualitative data was analyzed via the grounded theory approach. So that's the grounded theory that they're kind of using here. What they found overwhelmingly was that alcohol use was seen as a valid and legitimate excuse for deviant behavior. And the gender difference or gender expectations were widespread. Virtually all interviews contained some descriptions of gender difference, and they found women were more likely to use alcohol-related excuses for gender difference expressions than men did. It was about 84% versus 68%, and the authors wonder if it was because women's behavior is more closely policed. We think about this, oftentimes women, are viewed or policed or, in social situations have kind of higher standards or viewed more compared to men here. So when we're thinking about kind of that topic here, this idea of women's behavior being more closely policed, when we're thinking about this topic, and this punishment, is this due to this male patriarchy and male, basically our patriarchal society and the male supremacy that we see in our society here. And so they needed these excuses more than men do to do this. That was kind of like the purposeful explanation to why there was a difference in the finding, because of this patriarchal society, there's more policing. We see that, the women needed to, kind of provide more excuses because they feel like they needed, they were policed more and they needed the excuses more. So that was really kind of one of the purposeful explanations to why there was a difference in these findings here. All right, one second. Let me move on to the next one here. So findings for women. So we talked about the findings for women. Alcohol allowed women to be more assertive and aggressive with friends and romantic partners, and alcohol offered some protection from shame and stigma for women. Important, it's, offered some protection. It's not that, this alcohol was always just completely the excuse, but it did, provide some protection for those who, engaged in these gender differences here. That many participants freely reported using alcohol for the purpose of losing control. Some women even said that it increased their self-esteem because they can be more assertive and aggressive. All right, moving on to this next chart here. So examples of gender with women in terms of appearance here. You don't care what you look like, so they were less concerned. With the social construction of physical appearance and the gender, the social construction of their physical appearance with the gender that might make up, so really their expectations about this. They felt that they could be more outspoken, free to say whatever you want, loud, outgoing, almost feeling like, less censored. And they were allowed to be more sexually open in terms of propositioning other people, engaging in public displays of affection, perhaps maybe even cheating on their partner or pursuing sex. But, these are things that I think a lot of us who've gone out to high school or college parties, could probably attest to. And, especially, you got to think of these are things that are taking place in public. But, ultimately they almost felt like they could just be more sexually aggressive here. Gender differences for men. Oh, let me move on to the next one here. Involve being more open to showing their emotions. So I'm sure some of us can think of perhaps being around a drunk male friend, and suddenly, they open up. They, tell them, they tell somebody they love them. They get show these emotions that normally wouldn't happen. I mean, I'm sure we could probably think of these oftentimes in class. This is a time where we share some pretty comical stories, but I can think of a few examples of friends who were, tough dudes, didn't show emotion, and next thing you know, they were like crying and telling me, how important our friendship was here. So a lot of this for men was about showing, their emotions, and these gender differences, which traditionally in our society, men aren't really supposed to be showing their emotions. So crying on a friend's shoulder, even just expressing sadness, fear, emotions that we typically think of as non-masculine. This is something that we see happen when men use alcohol. Other examples included sexual deviance. This could be sex with undesirable women, or this could be sex with men for a heterosexual man here. So, we see that these were some of the findings that they found here, even having sex, a heterosexual man having sex with another man, could almost be excused under, because of alcohol, or that's, the justification. So some of the men give examples about what they'd like to call this term beer goggles. This is a term that used to be around relatively frequently. I feel like you don't hear it as much, but honestly, I'm old and not really around the drinking scene much here. But it's this idea, that I wouldn't, that this person normally wouldn't have sex with this woman, but because, whatever criteria they might base their sexual partners on, but because they were drunk, it was okay, and I think this is something that, findings, would show for both men and women, but looking at men, we see this research really showed this was a common one that happened with them. Some of the heterosexual men, or the men who identified as heterosexual, talked about having sex with other men in their interviews, and that they didn't feel that it changed their sense of sexual identity, because they were drunk, So yeah, I'm a heterosexual, but I got drunk and I had sex with a man, but in these interviews, they said they still identified as heterosexual. For gay men, they found that with alcohol, they felt more comfortable expressing their gay identity. And so this is something that's, described as been found a lot in the research, but, going out to gay bars, and alcohol was definitely a part of that, but really expressing themselves and feeling more comfortable to do that and using alcohol, kind of loosening in that environment, perhaps being out at a gay bar and feeling more comfortable expressing themselves, when they're in this environment, but also, using alcohol here. So, all right, moving on to the conclusions here. So in conclusion, alcohol is seen as an acceptable account for deviant or potentially stigmatizing behavior, and that alcohol aids in the performance of masculinity here, oh, excuse me, sorry, but also in excusing gender differences here. So, it's also, alcohol is a convenient and attractive way to engage in behavior that would otherwise be discredited. And, women reported increased self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-worth. So, these are the different things they found. Real quick here, moving on to this next slide here, examples of accounts and drugs. It kind of begs the question, could this be true for other substances here? So thinking about this, could this be true? What about marijuana? Can marijuana excuse behavior? Can perhaps, you think of any examples of that? we can think of it, does it provide a legitimate account? Do people accept, marijuana to excuse behavior? We think of the song Because I Got High, the exaggerations, it makes humorous the excuse of laziness. If you're not familiar with this song, this is Afroman, Because I Got High. It was incredibly popular, but basically the whole song's about what he was going to do, but then he didn't do it because he got high. So I don't, is that a valid excuse? But something to think about. Basically due to marijuana use and a motivational syndrome is illegitimately the pharmaceutical reaction here. So do we expect people to get lazy when they're stoned and almost accept it? So this idea, because of these different things here, this amotivational syndrome, causes teenagers to be lazy and not participate in expected norms here. So thinking, there's not a lot of signs that actually prove that. It's kind of the what came first, the chicken or the egg thing here. But so some people might use marijuana as an excuse or cannabis as an excuse, but the research hasn't claimed that. But we see that however, marijuana provides an excuse for behavior that would occur regardless of drug use, perhaps, and so that's something to think about also, with these teenagers, rather that teens are drawn both to activities because they seem to go hand in hand. Teens in general often just want to lay around and not do a lot, so that's one of these things is, cannabis providing an excuse for them to do this, or is this something that happens? Once again, there's a wide variability, but, I can think, oftentimes teenagers are thought of just wanting to, lay around and not do a lot and just have their parents leave them alone, so is that something, once again, this idea of the chicken and the egg, and it seems, but it does seem socially acceptable to sit around and not do a lot after you smoke cannabis, so is this something that, does kind of provide an excuse, excuse behavior, so maybe that's why they seem to think that these things are, kind of go hand in hand. When you smoke, cannabis, you tend to get lazy or not want to do anything here. But, this is just something to think about. I think we're much more commonly, familiar with, gender difference or, alcohol being an excuse for behavior. But it's interesting to think about this in terms of other, substances and what may be legitimate, what may be not. I think one of the big things we need to think of is alcohol is socially acceptable in our country. But as we're seeing that cannabis is becoming more socially acceptable in our country, will we see more behavior that, we front that's caused by cannabis, or I shouldn't say caused by cannabis, that is associated with cannabis, that, we may excuse because you were under the influence of cannabis, and just, whether this is certain things, behavior like, doing nothing, perhaps, getting the munchies or, eating excessive amounts of sweets. But, these are all things to really think about, in relation to this article, and how you could apply this to other different things here. Give me 1 second. I just want to pause this. And finally, here's some discussion questions. These are just something to think about. You're not required to put any response to this, but are there limits to what is socially acceptable behavior even when drinking, in our society? Where is kind of the line? Where do you cross the line? Is part of the appeal of alcohol the ability to get out of jail free? I've definitely, seen people who are going out and they plan on getting hammered and doing stupid stuff. Like it's almost like, the stupid stuff was what they wanted to do. And the alcohol is just kind of, provides the get out of jail free card. How does this relate to moral holidays such as Halloween, Sadie Hawkins dances, some of these different, moral holidays that also have associated with drinking and perhaps with the behaviors or excused behavior during these holidays. Another thing to think about are women who are sexually assertive, even breaking gender norms. Are they using alcohol to help them live up to the norms of being sexually available to men. Are women choosing to hook up with men, submitting to norms of being dominated sexually by men rather than acts of resistance to patriarchy and rape culture? Perhaps it is simply an adaptation and submission to it. These are just things to think about. Just different questions to spur your thoughts. And, also these are, some questions related to other research, but all in all, this is at the end for this here. I'm going to stop